Welcome to Imagine Otherwise, the podcast about the people and projects bridging art, activism, and academia to build better worlds. Episodes offer in-depth interviews with creators who use culture for social justice and explore the nitty-gritty work of imagining otherwise. I'm your host, Cathy Hannabach. Pandemic living and its merging of work and home have made many of us exhausted as we zip from Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting with even more packed schedules than before. Much of the advice about surviving our new normal privileges capitalist versions of sustainability. For instance, recommendations for how to work smarter and thus free up more time to get more things done. But what if we instead place disability justice logics at the core of how we understand sustainability and our new schedules? My guest today is permaculture designer and disability studies scholar Aimi Hamraie. In our interview, Aimi and I chat about using natural cycles to build sustainable schedules and prevent burnout, how disability culture practices like slowness and mutual aid reimagine sustainability as fundamentally collective, and why building a world beyond scarcity is how Aimi imagines otherwise. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
So this month at Ideas on Fire, we're focusing on how to build sustainability into our daily routines, as well as the long-term projects that we're part of. And I was really excited to have you back on the show, because I know you were on a previous episode, because I think you're someone who foregrounds sustainability in virtually everything you do in really interesting ways. And in many ways, you model how to do so, how others can do so, with integrity and compassion, including a lot of self-compassion, which is something that I know a lot of listeners struggle with. So maybe to start off our conversation today, what does sustainability mean to you? And what are some of the ways that you foreground it in your work?
That's such a great question. I think I have a complicated relationship to the word sustainability because, in my scholarship right now, I'm working on a project that's basically about how architects and urban planners, when they try to design for sustainability, which they mean environmental sustainability, that it doesn't always consider the costs to humans and other forms of life in terms of what the ends of sustainability are. And sometimes there's a very productivist focus even in the concept of sustainability. But I really recognize in my own life and in my activism the value of concepts of sustainability that come from, for example, the disability justice movement, that are really about kind of being honest about our capacity and where we're at, and honoring the limitations that we may face in terms of time and energy and just life, and being alive in a time of a pandemic, and being alive in capitalism. And so when I practice sustainability for myself, I'm usually thinking about what I am able to do as one person in a given day, and what I'm able to do with other people in more extended timeframes or through delegation or collaboration. And then just being really realistic. Lowering my expectations constantly of what I think I can do. And this is something I've had to learn how to do just because I'm a disabled person and I don't have infinite amounts of attention and energy to give to things. I think that when I was a younger scholar, and even before that, before I started graduate school, I didn't really have a concept of sustainability. I just sort of worked and lived crisis to crisis, and was constantly tired, and probably drank too much caffeine and things like that. And that had a lot of consequences for my body and my health. And so I've had to really intentionally slow down, set boundaries with myself and with other people, and really just evaluate how much time it's going to take me to do something, and figure out if I am going to be able to do it, and if not, to let people know. And I guess some of the ways that I foreground sustainability, I'm really into planning my time, which is a practice that actually comes from a very productivist mode of kind of doing planners and to-do lists and stuff like that. But I use it to slow down time. So I have like my planner that I do once a week and once a month. And then I go back after I've plugged in everything I have to do. And I say, where can I plan rest? Where can I plan slowness? How can I move things around? I try to do that with my students and my collaborators as well. So, right now with teaching, our semesters are planned to be the same length, but we don't get any breaks because they don't want students going home because of COVID. And so really reconceptualizing the pacing of the semester so it's more sustainable even without a break and what that might look like. And trying to do the same thing with scholarly collaborators and other people.
You mentioned that kind of how you've learned to build more sustainable practices into your life has changed over the years. And I think that's something that a lot of people are experiencing right now, is figuring out that their previous way of moving around in the world and approaching their work just isn't possible right now for a whole host of reasons. How did you actually go through that journey? Like, how did you realize, you mentioned, lots of caffeine and moving project to project and kind of cramming in as much work as possible, which I think is something a lot of academics can identify with. How did you go about identifying that those were practices, number one, that you could change, that could be different, and then figuring out what kind of different do you need it to be for yourself?
Yeah, I love that question. This has really been the focus of my ethics with self praxis, I would say, for the last 7 or 8 years. So I was diagnosed with ADHD relatively late relatively recently in my life. I wasn't diagnosed as a child. I was diagnosed in my first year on the tenure track. And I had suspected that I had ADHD for a long time, but of course, the sort of circulated signifiers of ADHD are kind of like young hyperactive children, often boys. And so there are a lot of people who live without a diagnosis, and as a result of that can't access accommodations or treatment. And so when I was starting my job as an assistant professor, I was having huge issues with executive functioning, which is just kind of the ability to manage all the tasks I had to do and think about them and order them and all that kind of stuff. And I was experiencing so much burnout from the combination of moving to a new city, starting a new job, living in a different region, all of that kind of stuff, and having to write a book. And so what I learned through this process, and really one of the great things about accessing a diagnosis, which of course not everybody has access to for financial and other reasons, but one of the really good things about it was that I was able to connect with other people who also have ADHD. And there are all these adults, there are therapists, there are people who write books, there are Facebook groups that are how to do executive functioning hacks. And just a real community-centered sharing of knowledge around how to, inhabit a way of thinking and feeling that is outside of the capitalist norm of productivity, and to do it in your own way without totally giving in to that capitalist norm of productivity. So without being this efficient worker who works a 9 to 5 and then, does whatever else. And so it was through kind of developing that as a community and also as a political identity and relating it to my other disabilities as a political identity, and learning and sharing knowledge and sharing my own knowledge with other people, that sustainability really just became a central focus of my life. And just the idea that you can write a tool or a protocol and give it to someone else and they can use it or tweak it and do something else with it, all of that is extremely valuable to me. And it contributes to this sense of, there is a collective affect of disillusionment and exhaustion and anger. And so there are tools that we may have that we can share with each other. And they're not just the sorts of self-help tools that we may think that they are. They're actually ways that we can join together with others and like resisting the things that are demanded of us, and slowing down and giving ourselves permission and each other permission to slow down. And I would say during the pandemic, it's changed even more because so many more people are encountering barriers related to their executive functioning, whether they have ADHD or another disability or not, because of all of the attention that is required of us through these like digital means. And within that also, just like every conversation I have is, it's okay to slow down. It's okay to postpone. It's okay to cancel. It's okay to negotiate an extension on an assignment, because that's really like a relational thing we have to make available to each other, because the, institutions and structures that we work for are not going to do that for us.
You mentioned disability justice as giving you a lot of these kinds of tools and helping you develop these tools that you share with others. And I know permaculture is another primary framework that you draw on in this kind of work. And first of all, for listeners maybe who aren't familiar with disability justice and permaculture, would you be willing to give a little bit of an overview? And then I'd love to talk more about kind of how those play out for you. But for folks who are new to these, what are disability justice and permaculture?
Great question. So I'll start with disability justice. This is a movement framework that was created by disabled people of color and queer disabled people really within the last 10 years. And it's sort of a response to the dominant disability rights framework, which is very much rooted in the idea of like an individual disabled person or an individual consumer. And disability justice is more liberation centered. So it's explicitly anti-capitalist. It's about interdependence. It's about collective forms of access and liberation. And it has some of its principles include sustainability and the idea of wholeness, that like we are all whole, regardless of what we're doing or what we're capable of or not capable of, but that we deserve, to dignity and respect and all of those sorts of things. And disability justice really also draws on transformative justice and abolition. And so it's really rooted in the kinds of relationships that we forge with each other in often very slow ways as a means to create a foundation for a shift away from the types of institutions that like police and surveil and exploit us. And so if anyone's interested, you can read more about disability justice from Leroy Moore and Patty Byrne and Leah Lakshmi Piechna Samarasinha and Mia Mingus and Alice Wong. These are all people that I've learned from in that movement. And there's a lot there about sustainability, and we can come back to that. And then the other thing is the permaculture movement, which is incredibly complicated in its history, but essentially permaculture is a method of environmental design that is about balancing and promoting like care for people, care for the earth, and care for the future. And it really comes out of this kind of pattern language of the forest and thinking about how forests are self-sustaining ecosystems. And they're made up of many layers and parts and specific ways of interacting with humans, some of which are more sustainable than others. So we have a clear example with like the wildfires in California, that the removal and displacement and dispossession of indigenous peoples in California who were, living in the forests and maintaining them and doing control burns and things like that has resulted in an imbalanced ecosystem that is not self-sustaining and is having these like larger conflagrations. And so permaculture is really about asking the question of, how do we create sustainable systems, and to do it in a way that is different from the sort of mainstream environmentalism that is about like recycling and doing kind of these like green capitalism things like, oh, if we just like buy this product that is slightly more sustainable, that, those are kind of very like performative ways of thinking about how ecosystems work, and they're often confined to specific channels of intervention. And permaculture kind of wants to open it up and ask questions that are a little bit more bold and promote different kinds of solutions, change agriculture, change forestry. And then there's this really cool part of it, which is a lot of where my interest comes in. That's really about activism and people and organizations. So there's a concept of social sustainability. And this comes from people like Starhawk and Pandora Thomas, who's the founder of the Black Permaculture Network. And they are thinking about how we can design sustainable relationships or community organizations. And if you're building a community garden, but it's going to take 3 years to clean up the soil, how do you build the relationships that are going to keep people in that project for several years? So in the work that I do as a permaculture designer, I get to ask those kinds of questions and actually bring in more of my toolkit as an activist who came up in anarchist and punk culture. And so mutual aid is a really big part of how interaction and connection and interdependence are practiced in those spaces. And then to kind of combine that with what I've learned from disability justice organizing for the last 10 years or so. And to put these together, to think about casting a very wide net in terms of what kinds of lives and ways of participating and bodies are valuable and ought to be centered. What kinds of social analysis needs to be centered, for example, around the intersections of race and sustainability, race and disability and environment. All of that stuff just sort of comes together for me. And I'm trying to, think about it also theoretically in various ways, but I think at a minimum, they're aligned projects.
I'm noticing there's more of a conversation or the beginnings of a conversation now 6-7 months into the pandemic where people are trying to figure out the lessons that they've learned from the past 6 or 7 months and figuring out how can they put them to work in the future in whatever that is going to look like, whatever this post-pandemic future will end up looking like. And it sounds like a lot of those frameworks that you're talking about in terms of building communal structures, relationships, practices, habits beyond the current moment has a lot to offer there, right? It's not just how can we get through the current moment, which is frankly hard enough, but also what are we learning about ourselves? What are we learning about each other? What are we learning about our families and how we define those and redefine those that we want to take beyond this current moment, right? And it seems like both disability justice and permaculture have a lot of lessons to offer in that practice. Are you also finding that in your communities?
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like I use these frameworks every day in various spaces, and kind of I'm grateful that, I was able to engage with these frameworks before the pandemic because it helped to prepare me emotionally and in terms of the sorts of really facilitation of conversations and negotiations that are required in this time, because, we are all exhausted to varying degrees, and some people more and less so than others. People are negotiating risk and information about risk and harm and potential harm in ways that are very stressful but necessary. They're having to rely on each other and build relationships and trust people sometimes that they don't know very well, to have a pod, whether it is for, getting your groceries or, your children being able to go to school or whatever, or, having someone drop off your medication. But just this sort of there's a more diffuse pattern of how we relate to people now in a way, even though we're more isolated. And there's just so much burnout too. I see with a lot of activists and scholars, there's so many events. Everyone is really tempted to make like a fancy video for their class, but it takes 25 hours to do it. And so being able to say, you know, what is really necessary and important here? What is really our capacity? Where can we kind of take a step back and not take every opportunity that comes up? And then also, most importantly, like, how can we be in solidarity and have really hard conversations, and to like work towards like chipping away at all of these institutions that are historically have brought so much harm and have now been kind of destabilized. And it's really an opportunity to like practice and show each other that there are other ways. So I see so much of that, whether it's in mutual aid organizing or in the classroom, just like the sort of the way that so many people's lives have been made extra precarious, or their labor has been made extra extractable, and people are mad, and trying to kind of funnel some of that into like, okay, let's build the next thing now with the way that we're feeling, even though we're exhausted. And let's not do it in the way that we would have done it before, because those ways are often grounded in like ableism and white supremacy. And so, you know, people are kind of like more willing to have those conversations now, I think, in a way, because they are reality disrupting conversations, but so much of our reality is just being disrupted on a constant basis now, for better or for worse. And so it does kind of provide an opening, I think. And I have seen also lots of people who are burnt out on building relationships and doing mutual aid. And that's fine. I mean, it's actually good self-care to say, I cannot have a conversation about this right now. Can we do it in like 6 months? So, yeah.
A couple of months ago, you published this really fantastic zine that I know draws on a practice that you've done for many years, that teaches folks how to map out their semesters using moon phases and seasonal patterns. And you focused it specifically on this fall semester, I think, to give people kind of an in who are new to this kind of practice. And I really love this as an example of how to build sustainability into daily routines, especially in this year. And I'm curious what you think are some ways that people can use natural cycles like moon cycles, like seasons, like whatever is applicable in their geography and in their life, to both figure out how they want to interact with others and with their work during this time, but also maybe set some patterns for after or beyond.
Yeah. Thank you so much for asking this. So I can kind of like say at the outset that this is a type of practice that's like one of the things that I have found my way back to in the last few years. And when I did, I was like, oh, okay. One of the reasons I was feeling so out of sorts is that I had become misaligned with time and the way that time manifests in my environment. And, you know, my ancestors were all like farmers in Iran for like however many generations, like longer than people can even remember. And my parents are the first generation who was like, you know, my parents are refugees. They were like dispossessed of land and displaced and came to the United States. But they're really like in the first generation that was also then disconnected from that relationship to the land. And there's a lot of like mourning and like anxiety and just like all sorts of stuff around that. And so when I was growing up in diaspora, watching my parents and grandparents like try to survive in the United States, like in this place where they didn't really speak the language, and like the plants were all different, and like all the social norms were different. Like what I saw them do was grow gardens and save seeds and grow the seeds that they brought over with them, and just like connect to time in different ways. And one of those ways was my grandfather, who was like so amazing for so many reasons. Like he was like a fruit tree grafter and amazing gardener. And he taught me about the moon phases. and the predictability of time. Like he was literally like, wherever you are in the world, this is how the moon behaves. And this is how you can kind of chart the evolution of time on a day-to-day basis, but also months and years. And so it's like, it was a constant between like living in Iran or living in the US or wherever else people were. And so when I was in graduate school, I started gardening for the first time since I was a child. And I started really small, just like in little pots on my porch, and eventually like grew most of my produce there. And just the practice of like planting a seed and watching it grow and taking care of it, and living in relationship to it and in a reciprocal relationship, and just like, fermenting food that I wasn't going to eat, all of these things, it just made me slow down, and it made me notice, and I felt happier, and I felt less frenzied, felt less anxious. And so it's kind of scaled up from there in different ways. But like what I realized at that time, and that I just think about constantly now, is that the sort of agrarian cycle for people who had a relationship to that, whether themselves or ancestrally, the agrarian cycle is the opposite of the school year cycle. The school year cycle says, at the time that you should be slowing down and getting ready to hibernate for the winter, you should instead be having panic attacks and deadlines and interacting with like hundreds of people, and actually like increasing the energy and sense of like frenzy and activity in your life. And then maybe for like 2 weeks in the winter, you take a break, and then you're at it again at the start of the spring semester. And that is just that does not feel good to anyone. And it's also why, like, when we get to summer, then it's so hard to be like productive sometimes, even though summer could be a time of like beautiful thinking and writing and all this stuff, but we're just exhausted. And so like thinking about what ways we do have control over that, like I don't get to set the calendar for the university, but I do get to just pace myself. And I get to think about time in different scales. So in my zine, I use the moon phases sort of as like a tool, but also as a metaphor for thinking about time in terms of like, increasing and decreasing the amount of energy and attention we want to give to something. So if you're planning like a unit in a class, and you look at your semester calendar and the patterns of the moon phases, and it's like, oh, the semester starts on a new moon. Great. We can introduce new topics. And by the time we get to the full moon, we can like have a quiz where we, make sure everyone understands. And then we can do a little bit of review and then move on to the next new thing. But sometimes the semester starts on a full moon. And sometimes you want to start with something that students may already know about that's really familiar. And then go through the process of like introducing them to something that's unfamiliar a little bit later. And I've been doing this for several years now, and I've just found that it's incredibly helpful to plan the semester that way, even if it means changing my syllabi slightly from semester to semester, because it sets a pattern and it gives a logic to what is happening, and an appropriate pacing, so that you're not spending like only one day on something that actually requires several days or a week. And then similarly with like the pacing of the semester on the whole, or writing projects or anything like that. I just wrote this piece that is kind of like a poem, but it's protocols kind of for writing in the autumn. And one of the things that I say in that poem is that you should write on the timescale of the radish seed, which germinates very quickly. But revise on the timescale of the pawpaw seed. Pawpaws are a native tree in Appalachia and Ohio and Tennessee, where I live, and they grow very slowly. And they don't produce seeds, or they don't produce new fruit for like 8 years. So it kind of just gives you a sense of what timetables can exist. Like if we want to say like in nature, in scare quotes, like in the non-human world, that there are different timetables, and they're not all useful for the same things. But if you kind of pick your alignments, then you may come out of it feeling a little bit more balanced and connected and things like that.
Do you find that you use these kind of moon phases or ways of thinking about increasing or decreasing energy to structure the Contra podcast? For listeners who don't already know about this podcast, first of all, go listen to it. It's amazing. But one of the things that I really love about it is kind of how you put together the conversations with the guests, but also how you work with your team there. So is this an approach that you've built into your team's workflow?
That's such a great question. And I will also say, like, the idea of a podcast workflow, it's something that you introduced me to when I was a new podcaster. So thank you for that. It's a little bit of scholarly mutual aid and podcasting mutual aid. So the way that we have done the podcast in the past has been wide ranging because different people in my lab have different types of expertise and skills. So generally what we did until the most recent season was we would kind of dream and think about, like, who do we want to be on the podcast? We would make appointments and interview people. And then there was a whole production process that included, like, the editing and mastering and stuff, but also getting transcripts and making show notes and doing, like, simple English summaries and links and all that kind of stuff for accessibility. And it's really one of the philosophies of, like, the work that we do in the lab is just to be really slow and not to exhaust ourselves and not to live on university kinds of timetables. And so sometimes things just take longer, and that's okay. But a lot of the production would end up getting done in, like, December of a year of, like, recording pretty much the entire year and then, producing the episodes and putting them in the order that we wanted them to be in and stuff like that. And I really liked that in the sense of its slowness, but then there was this kind of, like, at the end of the process, a lot of work over the winter. And sometimes you have time for that. Sometimes you don't. This year, we definitely don't have time for that because we're curating an art exhibition that's showing in January. And so what I did in the summer when COVID started was I started a series called Solidarity Chats, which were about disability and mutual aid. And, there were some episodes about eugenics and different things, kind of like what people should know about disability during COVID. And I produced all of those pretty much by myself with Kelsey Acton, who does the simple English summaries. But it was different because I was teaching from home and the temporality of everything had shifted. And so suddenly, because I wasn't commuting to work, I had extra time to do things like have short conversations and edit them and put them up. And so it was, like, produced really quickly. And not out of any imperative for productivity. It was just sort of how it happened. And so in having strategic conversations about the podcast moving forward, one of the things we just decided was to do both in the future, to have more formalized seasons that tell a story, and we record them all ahead of time and put them in order, but also to just, like, feel free in between to release episodes whenever it feels good and not have to be on a schedule. And in some ways, that's, like, the opposite of a moon phase approach because it's very, like, unstandardized, but it's kind of about, like, internal rhythms and realizing interconnectedness because, we don't have to put anyone else on our schedules either. We can just be like, hey, you want to have a conversation about this? And if now's not a good time, we can just do it later. And there's no pressure. And that's a cool thing about podcasting to me is that there's so many podcasts in the world that if I don't produce a season for a while, like, nobody's going to care. Like, it's just, they're going to have other stuff to listen to, or they can go back and listen to old episodes. And it's not tied to, like, my job or anything like that. So yeah, it's kind of, I guess, about, like, tuning into the internal temporalities of, like, your team and collaborators and just, like, checking in and practicing consent around energy and time and things like that.
Seems particularly important these days. Important all the time, but I think since everyone's dealing with shortened time spans and shortened attention spans and more stress, it seems particularly relevant now.
Yeah, absolutely. You can just produce less stuff. It's okay.
So this brings me to my favorite question that I get to talk with folks about that really gets at that big why behind all of the projects and the approaches that you take with your work. And that's that version of a better world that you're working toward. When you write zines, when you collaborate with people, when you participate in mutual aid, when you just hang out and chat and kind of are co-present with other people. What is the world that you're working toward? What kind of world do you want?
Wow, it's such a big question.
I know it's giant,
but I love it. I mean, in a way, it's like, I think about this kind of question all the time. I would say there are many worlds, that I want, and they overlap in certain ways. And on different timetables. Like, I mean, I absolutely want a world in which there are no prisons and police and nursing homes and institutions and places of incarceration. I want a world in which, like, we get there because we have built strong relationships and communities that are all about, like, good communication and checking in with each other and making sure that we're thriving and have what we need. And where scarcity and fear are not the kind of like ruling affects that determine how we make all our choices. I want a world in which we don't live election cycle to election cycle in sheer terror, and in which we kind of like divest from electoral politics, but also aren't as threatened by it. And I think that world maybe comes after the first one I said. I want a world in which all bodies are understood to be good and beautiful and worthy and valuable and whole. Where, there isn't violence against queer and trans people and Black and Indigenous people and other people of color. And I really, really want a world in which people just kind of feel in balance and aligned. And I don't know how to get there. It's like a world without trauma or something like that. But I really feel like we need that world because sometimes our trauma is what holds us back from all these other things and makes it hard to build relationships and practice sustainability. And these are what I'm describing are like abolitionist worlds, I think, and transformative justice, disability justice worlds. And maybe they're permaculture worlds in a way. I would hope that in such worlds, people would have more ethical relationships with land and with non-humans and with other humans, and certainly like less colonial relationships. Yeah, I guess that's my vision. I don't know that it's a utopian vision though, because I anticipate a lot of friction getting there. And I also feel like there are little pockets of it that already exist. And that's kind of where I try to spend my time.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing all of these ways that you are imagining and creating otherwise.
Thanks so much, Cathy. It was great to talk to you again.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Imagine Otherwise. Imagine Otherwise is produced by Ideas on Fire, and this episode was created by me, Cathy Hannabach. Audio editing was provided by the awesome folks at Pro Podcast Solutions. You can check out the show notes for this episode on our website at ideasonfire.net, where you can also read about our fabulous guest and find links to the people and projects we discussed on the show.